to do their work. Increasingly, more and more humanitarian activity is being carried out by armed forces that are often party to a conflict. The groups say that this is damaging to their work and further threatening security of their workers. But can this be avoided? So these are questions that we'd like to discuss during this panel session, and I'm very pleased to introduce to you our very esteemed panelists here. If you would allow me, I'd start with you, Mr. George Rupp. He's the CEO and President of the International Rescue Committee. Next to George, we have Charlotte Petri Gornitzka. She's the Secretary General of the International Save the Children Alliance. Irene is the Secretary General of Amnesty International, and Melker Mabeck is Deputy Head Security Unit at the ICRC. Last but not least, on my right here, Jim White is the Vice President of Mercy Corp. And I'd like to start with you, Melker, please. The question, of course, is should humanitarian workers have more protection so that they can carry on with their humanitarian work?
Well, I'm not sure, should I use one of these? Or? All right, thank you. Well, it's a tricky question to answer. I mean, obviously, humanitarians shouldn't be attacked, and obviously they should be allowed to do their job. In that sense, of course, they should be protected. Now, whether or not we need additional protection, then you easily get into some sort of thematical debate on what kind of protection are we talking about. Are we talking about additional conventions that need to be developed, or are we talking M16s and armored cars? So it's a wide topic that I hope we'll have a chance to talk more about. But from my point of view, and I think the ICRC's point of view, existing rules of humanitarian law, were they to be followed, are quite sufficient for the protection of humanitarian workers or journalists or a mother of 5 in North Kivu. And I, for one, find it difficult to argue why I should be more worthy of protection than this mother in Congo. So I would say that it's a simple, obviously it's not simple, but it's a case of continuing to try and apply existing rules, which today, of course, are being flaunted all over, rather than trying to develop new rules that we can ignore. So I don't know if that launches a debate or
Charlotte, those attacks have caused you to pull out of certain conflict areas, Chad and Darfur, I think. What would you have needed to stay in those areas?
If we take the example of Chad, the situation was as follows. We had just started our activity in Chad. We were new there. And we had a program in place. But when this killing of our program director happened, we took a decision, but it was not the only reason why we pulled out. One of the main reasons, on top of this human interest in the issue, was that we had a very hard time to fundraise for the program in Chad. And one of the things we need to encounter is that to have the capacity to run a program where staff is secure, it takes funds to do that. There are costs involved in that capacity. And we just took a decision, kind of a balancing act. Could we really run a program in Chad where people are secure in our staff when we are struggling so hard to actually find funds for the program as such? So capacity was one of the reasons as well.
Right, sorry. Irene, what do you think?
Well, I would actually, we are looking, of course, at humanitarian operations and what happens in the context of humanitarian operations. I think it's important to look at the context. And the context means that one cannot talk about safety only after a conflict has started. One cannot talk about a free society once the society is already in conflict. And many of the problems of security, or rather insecurity, arise because the overall situation is such that there is no freedom. And if you take Myanmar and Cyclone Nargis, the difficulties of gaining access of humanitarian workers to Myanmar has to be seen in the broader situation of what's happening in Myanmar, the human rights problems that take place there, the attack on activists and so on. So I think it's important not to see a humanitarian operation in isolation from the political context that's happening, and much more has to be done to protect rights before a society collapses into conflict. And as a human rights activist, I find that there is a very narrow focus on relief and on protecting humanitarian workers, when what we should be looking at is what's the situation of civil society in those countries? What's the situation of local activists and local workers in those societies? Very often the internationals tend to be better protected than the locals. So if you take Somalia, or you take Sudan, or you take any of these countries, local journalists are more at risk, local workers are more at risk, local human rights defenders are more at risk, and a lot more has to be done there. So I think we kind of need to broaden both the time and space within which we think about protection. If we're going to be effective, it has to be long-term. One has to look behind and really improve the infrastructure for protection.
How do you do that?
Well, I would say that first of all, there has to be much more. I mean, I agree totally with ICRC. I don't think you need any more laws. I think the laws are there. It's an issue of compliance. And it's an issue of tackling impunity. You know, when those violations take place, the international community needs to condemn them more strongly. You take Sri Lanka, you know, blockage of access, killing of journalists, attacks on humanitarian workers. Where was the condemnation of the international society there? We're here in Geneva. Where was the UN Human Rights Council? Silent on Sri Lanka. You know, if you do that, you encourage impunity, and impunity breeds more violations.
Would that help, George?
Well, I'm a little surprised at in the direction in which this discussion has started, but I find it to be very congenial. I also agree with Melker's initial comment. There's no reason that humanitarian workers should be safer than the mother of 5 in Congo, who is also very insecure. The most basic form of security that most of our international NGOs have sought is the security that comes from being accepted by the communities that we work with. And that gave us a kind of protection that we could not get in any other way. We've never, most of our organizations at least, have never had armed guards, never had that kind of military security, but we were protected by virtue of the fact that the communities within which we worked accepted the fact our being there to provide assistance to them, to provide it on an impartial basis depending on need, to be independent actors who set our own agenda in conjunction with those communities. And so the security that we seek is no different from the security that the mother of 5 in Congo seeks, or that our partner communities seek. The problem is that they too are insecure, and with them we have become insecure. And I think that has to do not with our tradition of seeking security by acceptance in the communities in which we worked, but by changes in the overall context in which we work. And those have to do with the militarization and politicization of humanitarian assistance, a whole large array of issues, and with the changing character of combatants in conflict situations where they are not clearly identified, they are not disciplined, they have access to small arms that are rampant in the areas where we work, and therefore do not abide by the rules that have been historically established, and that ICRC has been obviously crucial in helping to get established, but they are not noted and adhered to, which endangers not only us but all of the communities that we work with.
Jim, why do you think there has been there are reasons obviously for this increase of attacks on humanitarian workers. From your point of view, how do you see that this can it be contained?